thank you to some of the people that have worked very, very hard and tirelessly. Ana Mandasantos, our finance director, and of course your whole team that has worked so hard. We want to thank them. We want to thank also my chief of staff, Susan Kennedy, who is really in charge of the whole team and has done an extraordinary job. I want to thank also all my cabinet secretaries that have worked very hard on this budget, which was the most challenging one that we've ever had. I also want to thank the Lieutenant Governor Maldonado for being here today. Where is he? Somewhere. But anyway, then Senator Steinberg, thank you for being here, and other legislators whose name I don't have on here. And then that's it. But Ashburn, yeah, well, okay, good. But there's a whole bunch of them. I can see everyone with this lighting. Anyway, first let me just say that I believe that the budget should be a reflection of what we in California value most. And also it should be a representation of what our administration stands for, in good times or in bad. Now, we all know that we are managing through a global economic crisis, which is the worst since the Great Depression. But California should still be in a position to safeguard its most vulnerable citizens and take care of them no matter what, but we are not. Because our budget system is broken, and I've talked about that since I came into office, that we must reform our budget system and we must reform our tax system and our pension system that is skyrocketing. I now have no choice but to stand here today and to call for the elimination of some of very important programs. If we had reform in place, we would not be facing the Sophie's choice. It is clear that if for the last 10 years we would have had this budget reforms in place, we would have $10 billion less in a budget deficit. We know that every time we talk about reform, the lawmakers don't have any interest to really do those reforms. The special interests shout that we're balancing the budget on the backs of the poor, and at the same time they push the lawmakers to drain the budget when we have spikes in revenues and then scream for tax increases when we fall short on revenues. And the cycle goes on and on just like this. This is what we call the budget kabuki. Now, as you know, I presented my budget for this year in January, and it solved our $19.9 billion deficit. But several things, of course, have changed in the last 5 months. First of all, I asked our legislators for $8.9 billion in solutions. And after a special session of 2.5 months, they came up with $1.3 billion of solutions. Of course, by not dealing with the whole problem, that we lost time, and time is money. As a matter of fact, it cost the state an extra $2.8 billion by not having those solutions solved. We also pushed to be reimbursed significant expenses by the federal government, expenses that they should be paying for, not the state of California. Now, we expected to get $6.9 billion. We didn't get that whole amount, but we are successful. We have received already $700 million and expect an additional $3.4 billion. And Anna and Kim Bolshay can fill you in later on about where the negotiations are and how we are getting this money. Then the third is court decisions. Court decisions have increased our deficit because federal judges have blocked many of the changes that we have made to health and human services. So because these judges have prevented us from using a scalpel to go and trim some of those programs, we now have to use the axe and then eliminate some of those programs. And then there's, of course, T-Ridge, which is another $100 million. Because of all of that, we are forced to make more severe cuts that I have proposed in January, in the January budget. As a matter of fact, like I said, in the January budget, we had $8.9 billion worth of cuts to be made, and now it is $12.4 billion. California no longer has low-hanging fruits. As a matter of fact, we don't have any medium-hanging fruits. We also don't have any high-hanging fruits. We literally have to take the ladder away from the tree and shake the whole tree. We must make very difficult decisions. Reduce health and human services, including eliminating CalWorks. Eliminate 60% of funding for community mental health. eliminate child care funding except for preschool and after-school programs, and downsize some of our natural resource programs, and the list goes on and on. We are left with nothing but tough choices, as you can see. But I want you to know, I will not sign a budget until we fix our broken systems. I will not sign a budget if we don't have pension reform and budget reform. For instance, talking about pension, the cost of employee retirement benefits this year is $6.1 billion. That is more than what it would cost to keep CalWorks, childcare, mental health services, and in-home supportive services, just to show you of how much money we spend on those things. We cannot go on like this any longer. Both Republicans and Democrats must get serious and take action. They must pass the budget and pass serious reforms. I support the legislators in their plan to move forward with their own budget process. I've made it very clear to everyone that my doors are open, that we always are willing to work with them in every step of the way in order to get this done. And there's no reason why they can't present the budget to me by June 15th, so that I can sign the budget by June 30th before the new fiscal year begins. Now, I think it is very important and it is very critical that we get the budget done on time. I believe our lawmakers will do the right thing and they will solve the problem which has plagued our state for decades. It is time that we are putting the people of California, we are not putting the people in California on this roller coaster ride. Continuously, vulnerable citizens have been put on that roller coaster ride where one day we have the revenues and the next day we don't. It is time we learn from our history and from our mistakes that were made so that it never, ever happens again. We live in the best state and in the best country in the world. There's no two ways about it. Californians deserve a better system. So let's commit to get this done, Democrats and Republicans alike, and I can promise you that I will do everything that I can in order to get this problem solved. Thank you very much, and now if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
If I could ask you just a broad question to begin with. You said at the beginning of your presentation that a budget reflects the values, and I believe probably of the state, but specifically of you maybe in this particular case. Could you talk about those values? Because there are going to be people right outside this door who say your values are more about businesses, corporate tax breaks, things like that, than they are parts of the social safety net, which you are proposing to cut.
My values are to have a budget system in place that works, to have a tax system in place that is fair and that works and that is stable, and to go and bring the economy back as quickly as possible and to create the jobs which will create the extra revenues so that we can afford all of those programs so it reflects our values. That is the important thing. What we have to do is we have to fix what you see here. You see capital gains taxes going up, then they fall, then they go up, and then they fall, and they go up again. So that's what I'm talking about, the roller coaster ride. We can avoid that. We do not have to be in a position that we're in today if we would have fixed the broken system. But as I've said earlier, and I'm not here to beat up on the legislature, but the fact of the matter is I have proposed that so many times. I've pegged budget reform, to do tax reform. The tax commission, the bipartisan tax commission came in last year in October. We still haven't heard and didn't even touch the whole thing. And we got to go and reform our pension system because we can't continue on to have the rise like Justin CalPERS from $150 million to $3 billion over a period of 10 years. That is crowding out other programs. So those are the things that need to be fixed. And we are in a situation, as I said, that we have seen the perfect storm. We were hit by everything. But like I said, judges' decisions, by the federal government not paying up the bill, by economic crisis, by shortfall of revenues, by the pension situation, all of those kind of things we were hit with. And so we have not really passed the stress test. We know that our systems don't work. So let's fix those broken systems. That is the most important thing. That's where my value is.
Governor,
yes.
Every politician in Sacramento would say they're for more funding for higher education. But given that you're proposing the elimination of CalWORKs, food and rent for children, and deciding to delay tax reductions for business, how can you justify that choice? How can you justify raising money for higher ed, increasing the funds?
Well, I think that our priority is obviously to go and have as much funding as possible. But because of the economy being down and because of our failed budget system and tax system, we don't have enough revenues to be able to afford all those programs. So we had to make severe cuts. And as you know, and you look at the education, they have really experienced severe cuts in these last 2 years. And also in higher education, the fees went up by 40%. So this is, everyone across the board has been hit here in these last 3 years. And so, as I said, it is painful to make those cuts. It is painful for me and for, I think, our entire team and cabinet secretaries and everyone in the Capitol that we have to make those, create those eliminations of certain programs. But we are forced to do it. And I see very clearly the faces behind those numbers. I know how many people are suffering out there and how painful this is going to be. But this is just, it's not the only state that goes through these problems. There's other states that go through that, not that it makes it easier for our state, and other countries go through it. You see what's happening in Greece, you see what's happening in Ireland, you see what's happening in Spain now, and everyone has to go and look at it and say, we got to go and come to the realization that we can't continue spending money and promise people things that we can't keep. That's all the revenues we have. Let's not forget, when you look at the baseline revenues this year, you will see it's $76 billion. That's without the fund shifts and without the tax increases that we have started last year. So $76 billion was exactly the revenues that were when I came into office in 2003. Now, the GDP then was $1.3 trillion. The GDP now is $1.85 trillion. So look at that increase over the last few years. But not when it comes to our revenues. So there is something wrong with our system. This is what I'm trying to tell people. This is the evil. Now, there will be people screaming for more taxes. We've done that. We've done that last year. We've done the biggest tax increase. The way we create the extra revenues that we need so badly is by stimulating the economy, by creating jobs, getting people to work so they pay taxes, and therefore we have more revenues. So the stimulating the economy, as I said in the State of the State, maybe the deficit has changed, but my goal from the State of the State address in January has not changed at all, which is let's stimulate the economy and let's create the jobs. That's the important thing. Yes, please.
From this time around, in the past you've proposed rainy day fund and bringing out the tax commission. Can you define what you hope to get in negotiations with the legislature?
I hope to look at the tax reform and what the bipartisan commission has presented. And they've laid it out. They've studied the subject very carefully, and I made it very clear to the legislative leaders that I'm not interested in just sticking with that formula, but that we should get together, we should study that, and we should go and have reforms based on that. Because we need more stable revenues. We can't continue on like we have here with the income tax and capital gains tax that shoots up and down. Over 50% of our revenues come from income and capital gains tax. And that is very, very volatile. So as long as we fix that, we can never promise the people certain things. And we should be able to go and look at the people and say, you will have from now on your increase of education funding every year. We should be able to go and say this to the state employees. We should be able to say this for the in-home services, for everybody. If we start creating a straight line based on inflation and population increase, then we will be safe and we will always see increases. But if we see spikes in revenues and spend it all for ongoing programs and then promise based on that this is what we're going to give you in the future, like with pension in 1999. I mean, things were promised that the stock market would be at 24,000, when in fact it's barely at 11,000, and that there will be investments that will bring in 8.5% and all of those kind of things. These are all crazy things that you can't promise. How can you guarantee those things? I mean, the pension system was fine, but they had to go and change it. And now we can pay for it. Now all of a sudden the taxpayers are paying $6.2 billion in pensions. And now CalPERS has just asked us to pay an additional $600 million because they fell short with their investments. So we have to fix those things. So what I want to get out of it is to reform the taxes, and let's have a rainy day fund. Because remember, just alone, if we would have a rainy day fund today, the 12.5% of our annual budget, when it was $100 billion, it would have been $12.5 billion. We would have divided that up into 4, because let's say there's 4 problem years. We would have had every year $3 billion. And that would have been just enough to help our students in higher education a little bit. That would have been just enough to help so that we don't have to lay off that many teachers. That would have been just enough for law enforcement and enough for in-home services and some of those very important things. That's why Arkansas, President Clinton has talked about many times, you guys are crazy not to have a system in place like we have, that when you have a drop in revenues, you know exactly which programs you cut first. And which are the programs that are way down that will barely ever be cut. That shows priority, that state has priorities. But we just couldn't get that done. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Governor, how serious are you about eliminating CalWorks? You proposed this once before. You did not eliminate it last time. Is this a starting negotiating point? And have you considered the impacts, cost shifts that this would push onto counties and local governments and loss of federal funds? Absolutely.
We have spoken to the cities, to the counties. We have reached out to everybody. We made it very clear, including law enforcement, people from healthcare, education community. We've reached out to everyone to let everyone know. So this is not a surprise hit. It's not meant to be that, because in the end we have to solve the problems together. We all have to come together on this. And so, there will be, the counties and cities, and they all will be suffering because of that. But the bottom line is yes, we have proposed it last year, and we negotiated. And throughout the negotiations, we then decided not to do it. I want to say also that last year, I hope that this year, we have the same kind of a collaboration between Democrats and Republicans as we had last year. Because it was really remarkable of how both of the parties came together, and only because of that we were able to fix $60 billion in deficit. And this is why this Monday in Boston, they will get the Medal of Profile and Courage Award. Now, that comes from, as you know, the Kennedys, and for 2 Republicans to get from them, the Medal of Profile and Courage is extraordinary. And there will be also the 2 Democratic leaders. But it is because they looked at the whole world of who has really been courageous to do things that they normally wouldn't do. And that's what it takes. You got to be very courageous to go and sit down and to solve those problems that we have here. And you have to go beyond your party rhetoric and all of this. And that's where I am. I'm looking forward working with the Democrats on this. I'm looking forward working with the Republicans, because it's really a major problem. And the only way we can do that is by us coming together and thinking about what is best for the state of California. And, my budget, this is our version. Then they will get involved, the legislators, and we all will be looking at each other's kind of way of looking at this whole thing. So anyway, thank you very much. And now let me introduce our budget director, finance director, they call it here, Ana Maria Santos. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good luck. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking my colleagues at the Department of Finance, our program budget managers, our assistant program budget managers, and their teams for all their hard work, not only in putting together the May revision, but in managing the budget and working on prior cycles and continuing to work on addressing our difficult fiscal challenges with a great deal of integrity, intelligence, and also just being wonderful people to work with. The governor spoke about the difficult choices that balancing this budget will require, some of the very severe cuts that are included in the budget. I'll start walking through the numbers and some of the things that have changed since January. In the January budget, we projected a budget gap of $19.9 billion. Some things have made that problem smaller, some things have made it larger. Things that reduced the size of the problem was $2.1 billion comprised of $1.3 billion in special session solutions, $700 million of additional funds we've received from the federal government, as well as $100 million that's being achieved through administrative actions that have been supported by the legislature. On the other direction, we've had a $600 million revenue loss, $500 million in cost increases associated with caseload changes as well as with litigation, and then another $200 million associated with changes to the reserve. The resulting number that the May revision addresses is $19.1 billion. On the solution side of the equation, some of the solutions that were included in the January budget now have reduced budgetary value, as the governor explained, $2.8 billion less in budgetary value for solutions due to the delay between March and July, as well as Proposition 10 and Proposition 63 not being on the ballot in June. $2.8 billion for federal funds. Some of the policy changes that the governor spoke to in the areas of public safety, in the areas of resources, the Rankin-Rich change, as well as the no longer proposing the suspension of the competitive Cal Grants program. Those add about $500 million in reduction of the value of the January solutions. Quick on the revenues. As you know, revenues had been tracking positively in the month of January, February, and March. We come into the month of April, substantial reductions in our revenues that are generally associated with a couple of things. One is the capital losses brought into the month of April were much larger than previously estimated. We have capital losses of $118 billion in 2008, which in turn reduced the capital gains revenues. Further, small businesses and impact on proprietors' income. Sorry, I can't really say that word. But S-corps and partnerships and other corporations, there's been a substantial reduction in their income that's also impacting our revenues, as well as quarterly payments. And with some accelerations, there had been an estimate that more payments were going to be coming in April, and instead of some of those payments coming in earlier in the year, in part based on the changes on the income and side of the equation, those dollars are coming in at different points in time. So we have a reduction in our personal income taxes this year, as well as a reduction in projected personal income taxes for the coming year. And if I find my handy chart, I will tell you what those numbers are. Well, we can follow up later, but the net of those is roughly $600 million, as we spoke about. In terms of the reduction side of the equation, K-12 schools, essentially the funding for schools is similar to the level of funding for schools proposed in the January budget. The level of reductions that would be achieved in terms of cuts to schools would be roughly the same. The big change in Proposition 98, as the governor has spoken to, is the elimination of the child care program with the exception of after school and preschool. That elimination generates savings of $1.45 billion and has a resulting effect on a reduction on the Proposition 98 guarantee of the same amount. In terms of higher education, as the governor spoke to, the May revision retains the same level of increases and protection of higher education funding that was included in the January budget. So that's growth funding in addition to restoration of one-time cuts that had been done due to federal funds being available. And there's no longer a proposal to reduce competitive grants for Cal Grants. In the Health and Human Services area, as the governor mentioned, some of the reductions in this area, there's the elimination of CalWorks for savings of $1.1 billion. That's in addition to some of the January proposals that would have reduced grants as well as made some changes in eligibility in the program. 60% reduction in community mental health funding, That's savings of $602 million. Reductions in drug Medi-Cal program, basically elimination of substance abuse services with the exception of those services being provided to children and pregnant women. In the January budget, there was a proposal to contain costs in the Medi-Cal program that would have saved $750 million. That proposal, rescored, saves $523 million, and it contains a series of copays, caps and limits on the number of services that are provided, as well as some rate freezes and other components. Also includes savings associated with the transition of seniors and persons with disabilities into managed care. Other reduction in the in-home supportive services program, that program is retained. There is a target of savings to be developed by the administration in consultation with stakeholders of $750 million. In the corrections area, the governor is proposing to continue funding for local public safety programs, as well as to establish a new block grant that will provide resources to local government to manage low-level offenders who would have sentences of 3 years or less. That proposal, net savings of $243.8 million. The reduction for prison health care remains, and that proposal has savings of $811 million. Governor's spoken to resources, just clarifying, parks is fully funded. On the federal fund side of the equation, as the governor referenced, it's $3.4 billion in federal funds. The bulk of those funds comes from the extension of the additional temporary assistance for the FMAP, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but the additional federal funds that help fund the Medicaid program. It's another $1.6 billion of additional federal funds that we'll continue working with the federal government on relative to dollars owed to the state for claims paid erroneously by the state, as well as additional funding for the cost of incarcerating undocumented immigrants and other areas of the budget that we believe we can get additional federal funds from. In terms of the trigger, there is no trigger included in the May revision. However, we will continue to monitor how the federal funds are progressing, and if additional solutions are needed to ensure that we have a properly balanced budget, the governor will propose those additional solutions to the legislature for consideration before adoption of the budget. A word on cash. The state will continue to have projections of sufficient cash to meet its obligations through the balance of this year. The cash management bill that was passed by the legislature in the special session will be very helpful in providing additional flexibility through the summer. And we will, at the governor's direction, the Department of Finance will be working with the controller and the treasurer on any additional cash solutions that may be needed to ensure we have adequate cash through the summer, as well as sufficient cash coverage to ensure we can secure the external borrowing necessary to deal with the ebbs and flows of our receipts and expenditures. So anyway, with that, I'll stop and answer any questions you may have. $1.4 million. Roughly 2/3 of the program's enrollees are children. Roughly 1/3 are adults. Sure. The grant level is approximately 600? 694. The average grant is around 500. On an ongoing level, it's $3.7 billion. If additional federal funds are continued as consistent with the president's budget, it would be another $500 million, so it'd be a total of 4.2. Those funds, however, are contingent on the state having the necessary state resources to meet the requirements and draw down those funds.
You mentioned the elimination of drug Medi-Cal program. Is this like prescription drugs for people, or is it people?
The bulk of the dollars is the narcotics treatment program. It's basically methadone and replacements for people with opiate-based addictions. There's other services, but that's the bulk of the dollars. 160,000. Thank you, Mr. Buchan. That's cases, not necessarily individuals. But it'd be roughly the same. Yeah.
I don't quite understand the cash situation after the beginning of the
The cash management bill provided us additional flexibility. We're working on the specific cash projections, but the and we will provide additional details. We know that the cash management bill has been very helpful. We're okay through June. There may be some issues late summer, and we'll be working with the controller and the STO both to narrow down the scope of the problem as well as necessary solutions. Late budget provides with a budget in place, which is Plan A. We would be going out as similar to the January budget and doing an interim RAN, and then doing additional external borrowing to make sure that we have sufficient cash to pay all our bills on time.
If there's not a budget, at what point do you run into cash problems?
We think that there would be potential problem in the late summer, but we're working on the revised cash flows to be able to have a specific, solid answer on that question.
How many prisoners a year would be sent to the local jails?
It's, I think, a 15,000 reduction of 15,000 in state population, right?
About 10, 11 is about 10,600 growing to almost 15,000 in the next fiscal year.
Did you hear Zlatko, or do you want me to repeat it? 10,600 next year, growing to 15,000 in the out year.
Go through the Prop 98 funding a little more clearly in terms of like what's the actual reduction?
The reduction from on the school side of the equation, the reduction from what schools would expect or would receive under a workload budget is $2.8 billion. The Prop 98 guarantee on the natural would have actually gone down in 9-10 and increase in 10-11. The governor's May revision proposes to retain that over appropriation of about $500 million in the 9-10 year. The other change that affects Prop 98 is childcare, and that number is 1.453. The resulting Prop 98 guarantee is 48.4. The level of funding that schools would receive is roughly the same as it was in the January budget. And if it's helpful, we can give you a table that shows pre and post childcare to be able to give you a sense of what happens to funding to schools.
What's the total? It's probably in here, but the total difference in general fund total this year versus budget year, the exact dollar amount.
It's 80. You're spending or revenues?
Spending.
Okay. Spending, it's 86.5 to 83.4.
83.4 in the budget year under this proposal.
Correct.
Can you talk about the shifting of gas tax money? I thought that was not doable out of the excise tax, which you guys said earlier near the highway user tax.
The shift as it relates to schools or the... Oh, that's all right. That's it's a loan. When the governor proposed the transportation swap, there would have been a drop in there would have been a tax cut to motorists. The legislature left some of that higher revenue, but it's not allocated in the budget year. So there's $650 million of additional gas tax resources that have not been allocated to any program that are borrowable. That would have to be repaid in the future, and our proposal is that it be repaid in 2013. It's dollars. It's excise tax dollars that were raised in as part of the transportation swap that have not been allocated to any particular transportation source for the budget year.
Is this the same tax dollars that local governments were so angry about last year?
No, everything in transportation was fully funded through the transportation swap, as well as some restorations to the transit program. This is money that would have accrued to transportation that was not allocated to any particular source. So it's money that would normally be available for allocation to different transportation programs, but it's not money that any particular program was expecting to receive because it has not been allocated by the legislature.
Where does the $650 million get spent in your proposal?
It's just part of what is helping the resources, so it's basically counts as revenues and resources available for spending. That, you got it. I'd add consumers to the group we'd work with. Basically the optional programs that are currently in effect would remain. The May revision would propose to establish some caps or limits to the availability of those, to the level of benefit that would be available, to a level that is consistent with the 90th percentile of utilization by Medi-Cal consumers. So there's no changes in the number of benefits being provided, with some exceptions in terms of some over-the-counter drugs are being changed, and so yeah, and there's a restoration of optometry services. But generally, in the trigger, there would have been an elimination of optional benefits. The May revision does not propose the elimination of the remaining optional benefits. Instead, it proposes caps for some of those services. I'm looking at Kim to make sure I didn't get that wrong. All right, we're good.
Just to clarify, that FMAP money that you, the extension,
Yeah.
when does that run out? That's not a never-ending.
Under current law, that the additional FMAP is available through December of this year. Under the proposed extension, it would be in effect for another 2 quarters, so it would last through the balance of 2010-11, June 30th of next year.
January, the general fund spending was 82.9. Going from memory,
The federal funds would be, the bulk of the additional federal funds would have offset general fund expenditures. So when the federal fund number goes down, the general fund spending would go up by a commensurate amount. So the federal funds were available to offset, greater federal funds would have offset a greater portion of general fund cost, with a lower amount of federal funds than the general fund expenditures go up. Does that make sense? The state would no longer be providing these services. Individuals would rely on services provided by counties and other such services, but it'd be a net substantial reduction in the available services to these families and children.
Wouldn't there be an associated cost with that, though? I mean, at the end of the day, someone in California has to pay for those services. Is there any evidence that the job gains that you're going to get from the tax reductions is going to offset those eventual costs of pushing all these people on the
The solution is basically intended to ensure that we have our spending balanced with our available resources. There would be a reduction in state cost. We recognize that there would be a substantial impact to families, as well as potential demand for other services. It's from a general fund standpoint, we'd achieve those savings, and it's consistent with what we have available resources to spend.
Do you guys anticipate that that could lower sales tax revenues next year as well, as pending increases among these families?
We don't have a sales tax revenue estimate associated with that. We have baseline adjustments based on what's going on in the economy, which is much greater than the value than any particular solution we're talking about.
So the 160 cases or individuals who are currently 160,000 currently have mapped it up. What's your guess as to what happens to them?
The state would no longer be providing that service based on the general fund situation, and there'd potentially be there's some federal funds that are available in this area for substance abuse services, and we would no longer be providing those services.
What are the options for the $750 million in IHS savings? Where would it, because it's undefined, right?
Yeah, and you've seen some of the options as in prior proposals made by the administration's efforts to target services to the neediest consumers, efforts to look at reducing our state participation in wages. We're looking at bringing other stakeholders to the table and seeing what ideas they have to bring for how we can deal with the long-term rate of growth in this program and maintain an in-home supportive services program that is consistent with the level of resources that we have available to spend.
Hasn't the administration said that level of savings is unachievable given what's going on with the courts?
we believe that substantial savings can be achieved in this program, and we're looking forward to working with stakeholders to make that happen.
How do you deal with the courts who said you can't fund the programs to the extent that you proposed in the past?
Those cases are in active litigation, and we are looking forward to working with stakeholders on solutions that will get us the necessary budgetary savings.
Can you explain this $602 million to the food stamp and child welfare services program?
That's associated with the mental health proposal. So basically, the way in which that proposal works is the state would, under 1991-92 realignment, the state provides roughly $1.037 billion to local to fund local mental health services. That funding would be reduced to $435 million. The resulting $602 million would in turn be shifted to fund increased costs in child welfare and food stamps. So the general fund savings comes from child welfare and food stamps. The programmatic impact happens on the mental health side. There'd be a reduction in local county mental health services of $600 million.
The governor mentioned downsizing natural resources programs. What programs are you guys downsizing?
$5 million in reductions to Department of Fish and Game.
That's it?
Yes.
So all the triggers deal with revenue, extension of the tax credit for dependents, the corporate stuff, that's all out of there.
Yes, the governor stated the budget does not include any tax increases.
Does the budget include, but does the budget have any new revenues and fee, and you still have the ERI in there?
The emergency response initiative is included. The alternative speed enforcement from January remains included. There's additional loans, as I believe it was Shane who asked about the $650 million associated with borrowing gas tax services. There's gas tax revenues. There's additional loans and borrowing from various special funds, as well as delays in repayment of loans. And you can see on page 4 of the publication those additional resources included in the May revision, and it's $2.1 billion in fund shifts and other revenues that are in total $1.6 billion in the May revision, and for alternative funding is $1.3 billion in total, $252 million in the May revision.
In terms of interest cost on state borrowing, I think I'm seeing here on page 14 $20 million reduction. Is that just on actual state general obligation bonds, or is that taking any other kind of borrowing?
It's general obligation bonds as well as external financing. So it's reduction in the cost estimate for general obligation bonds, and then about $200 million of it is associated with an updated estimate for what it will cost to obtain the necessary external financing for the budget.
So that's just, you're assuming that that's because of decrease in interest costs on borrowing?
Interest costs, and then the cost of issuance being lower than initially anticipated. Any other questions? Yeah? Optometry is being proposed consistent with federal law. There's an unrelated federal law. It's not a Medicaid one that requires that benefit be restored.
When you talked about Prop 98,
Mm-hmm.
you said that the cutting the child care services lowers the guarantee by $1.4 billion. Were there other things pushing it back up higher that made it so it hasn't moved and otherwise would be lower?
The hold harmless language that had been included by the legislature would bumped up the size of the guarantee to some extent. Revenue changes also increased it. Revenue changes dropped it in the current year, increased it in the budget year. Property tax estimates also changed the general fund, the required general fund share, but not the total guarantee number.
Does the lowering for child care to Prop 98 affect per pupil spending, or is that just sectioned off for?
It does affect per pupil spending, and we've done a calculation with it in and with it out to show comparable level of per pupil, and HC can provide that to you.
And when the overall proposal stays flat, does that mean it retains the $2.5 billion cut that the governor proposed in January?
The general fund savings compared to the workload level is $2.8 billion. So that the 2.4 is now 2.8. based on updated revenue information and other changes.
Increase to the cut of $400 million.
From a school standpoint, the level of funding they'll continue to receive is the same. The revenues have changed the guarantee, so the same policy has now a different value based on updated numbers.
Okay, so the 2.8 cut, what year is that drawn from?
It's a combination of all 3 years. Actually, 2 years. It's 9, 10, and 10, 11. There's no longer an 8, 9 component.
Can you do one last thing, just the major components? The budget says it's 12.4 billion in spending reductions. Just sort of categorize what the big chunks are. How much of that is schools? How much is Medi-Cal? How much is just sort of categorize.
It's 2.8 in, let me do it from memory before I get my charts. 2.8 from schools, 1.45 from childcare. It's about $1 billion from corrections, and that includes the reduction in prison health care as well as the other reduction. And where's my health and human services number? Sorry, I can't find my total health and human services, but what? 3.5? 3.5 for health and human services.
The big pieces of that is welfare, IHSS.
It's 750 in IHSS, 523 in Medi-Cal. It's 1.1 billion. Well, actually, 1.6 billion dollars in CalWorks, 600 million in mental health, and other reductions. Anything else? All right. Thank you. If you've got questions later, let us know.